Last time that we were talking about things, we were talking about how white South Africans made up a minority part of the population. Black South Africans made up a bigger part of the population. However, Black South Africans only owned a small percentage of the land. We talked about how there was your white South Africans, Black South Africans, colored South Africans, which were people who were biracial, and then your Indian immigrants. Sometimes Indian immigrants were included with the colored population. We're going to make a new bullet and we're going to write down peaceful protests. So bullet, peaceful protests. So not everybody was happy about the fact that they weren't given voting rights, that being, almost 80% of the population couldn't vote. And because of that, there were some peaceful protests against the government. Now, the person who first started up these peaceful protests was an Indian lawyer named Mohandas K. Gandhi. Go ahead and make a 1, if you would. And we're going to write down 1 Indian lawyer and then equal sign Mohandas K. Gandhi. So 1 Indian lawyer equal sign Mohandas K. Gandhi. So there was an Indian lawyer, and his name was Mohandas K. Gandhi, and he's traveling by train in South Africa because he was a lawyer, and he has just gotten his degree for being a lawyer in England. And he was traveling by train in South Africa because he had been hired by somebody in South Africa, an Indian businessman, to be his lawyer. And while he was traveling on the train, he was traveling in first class because, he's a lawyer. Of course, he has money to buy a first class ticket. However, if you're Indian, you're not allowed to sit in first class. Only white South Africans can sit in first class. And Gandhi's like, well, I'm a lawyer, so yeah, I'm not moving. In any case, he gets chucked off the train. This kind of ticks off Gandhi. He then starts organizing peaceful protests against the government about the rules for Indian immigrants that he didn't think were fair for Indian immigrants. Go ahead and make a 2. Peaceful protest. And then we're going to make an equal sign and write down non. So a non-violent peaceful protest is just that. It's when you protest against something, but you don't use any violence. So you don't destroy, you're not like attacking anybody, you're not destroying any buildings or anything. That's a peaceful protest. And Gandhi was pretty forceful about doing peaceful protests and not fighting against the government. So he didn't fight against government. He just did his protests. And he wasn't advocating any violence or destroying any property. It was just, nope, this is just a peaceful protest. And he was able to get some forms of civil rights for people in for people in South Africa who were Indian immigrants. Now, Gandhi does eventually end up going from South Africa into India and protesting against the British there as well. So he starts off as nonviolent protest in South Africa against the British. He eventually goes back home to India, where he also then continues doing peaceful protests against the British. And when people in his group did get violent, he would then go on a food strike until they stopped. He'd be like, nope, I'm going to go on a food strike until the violence stops on my end. So he was very forceful about keeping everything nonviolent. All right. Make a new bullet. African National Congress. So new bullet, African National Congress. So the African National Congress takes a lot of inspiration from Gandhi. And the African National Congress, sometimes called the ANC, but the African National Congress, it was created to aid in the civil rights movement. And it was created in 1930. Go ahead and make a 1. And we're going to write down created to aid in the civil rights movement. So African National Congress created to aid in the civil rights movement. You'll sometimes see this color scheme of black, green, yellow, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. That's for kind of a worldwide civil rights movement color flag. All right, so that flag color is there. That was a kind of, as I said, a worldwide color scheme that you would see a lot for civil rights for people in the 1970s and 1980s. Sometimes the movement for that color scheme is called Olderdom. So you do kind of see that scheme kind of come around there. So once again, black, green, yellow, you'll see that as the color scheme for a lot of civil rights movements in the 70s and 80s of the black, green, and yellow. All right. I said established in 1930, but I'm not seeing that in my notes there. So we'll write that down. All right. So I'll go ahead and make it 2, and we're going to write down established in 1930. Going to write that down for number 2. So established in 1930. Established in 1930. So what was the African National Congress? What were they protesting against? What were they kind of established for? Well, they were kind of trying to get equal rights for people in South Africa, so they could vote, so that Black South Africans could vote. There are some other laws, though, that were also discriminatory against people that were non-white. Go ahead and make a bullet. We're going to write down laws. So bullet laws. So you had kind of two people. You kind of had these, different social groups. We talked about before how there's white South Africans, black South Africans, colored South Africans, and then Indian immigrants were sometimes separate from the colored South Africans, but sometimes they were considered to be colored South Africans. It gets a bit confusing. But you basically had those social groups in Africa. And in 1948, the idea of apartheid, separateness, became law. Go ahead and make a 1, and we're going to write down 1. 1948, apartheid becomes law. So 1948, apartheid becomes law. So apartheid, that splitting of people into groups, separateness, that became a law in 1948. So before it was kind of just an idea that was enforced, it was law, but then it becomes a law that's enforced in 1948, even though they already had forced black South Africans to live on like 10% of the land. So what were some of the apartheid laws? Well, there was one thing called a pass law. Go ahead and make it 2. Write down pass law and then equal sign. Allow them to have jobs and travel out of the homeland. So 2, pass law, equal sign, allow them to have jobs and travel out of their homelands. So the pass law was a law that says if you're a black South African or even if you're an Indian immigrant, you got to carry around the passbook with you. This allowed you to travel, and you could be asked at any point in time to show your passbook to somebody. So if someone wanted to make sure that you were legally out of the townships areas, you would have to be like, "Oh, hey, here's my passbook," and then the passbook would show that they're allowed to be out and so forth. So the pass law, you had to carry around a passbook with you all the time, unless you were a white South African, then you didn't have to. But black South Africans, Indian immigrants, color South Africans, they all had to carry a passbook. And a big problem, like I talked about the other day, was that the only place really where you could get a job was in the white South African areas. All right. So in the white South African areas, that was the only place you could get a job. Part of the reason why you could only get a job, make a 3 and write down the only work was in white areas. Part of the reason why you could only get a job in the white South African areas was because in the black South African areas, the places where they had to live at, the townships areas, which was 13% of South Africa's land. The only reason why there was jobs in the white South African areas was because you weren't allowed to make a business in the black South African areas. So if you want to make McDonald's, for example, you live in a black South African area, nope. Although just outside of it, yep. So there was, not only were white South Africans kind of controlling all the economy and all the laws and so forth, but they're preventing black South Africans from being successful on purpose by not allowing them to develop businesses within their own areas. This also meant that a lot of times that black South Africans would have to leave their homelands areas, their houses and such, and they would have to go and work in white areas for a particular time, like for a while, and then they would come back. So it wasn't like you would just leave and come back the same day. It's like, no, you would leave and then come back like weeks or even months later. So pass checks, like we talked before, they were performed at random. If you didn't have your pass with you, you could be arrested or fined. There was also work camps you could be sent to if you didn't have your passbook with you. Eventually, there's a guy that comes around, Nelson Mandela. Go ahead and make a bullet. Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela eventually comes around. He's the leader of the African National Congress. So he comes around and he begins a campaign of non-violence. So he kind of begins a campaign of nonviolence against the South African government. The South African government eventually arrests Nelson Mandela and froze him in jail for 27 years. They arrest him because they claimed that he was a communist. So remember, this is after World War II, and the United States doesn't like communism. Now I realize the United States isn't South Africa, but because we didn't like communism, we basically overlooked any other government that was arresting people claiming that they were communists. So if they're, South Africa was arresting people and saying that, oh, hey, they're just a communist, we just kind of looked the other way because we were like, oh, hey, they're a communist. Okay. So yeah, because we didn't like communism, and anybody who else was fighting against communism, we simply supported them in what they're doing, even if they're lying totally about it. All right. So Nelson Mandela, he's in jail. He ends up being in jail for 27 years. He spends in jail. Go ahead and make a one. Write down 27 years in prison. So 27 years in prison. So he spends 27 years in prison for just trying to get civil rights for Black South Africans in South Africa. He's eventually released in 1990 because the president of South Africa at the time, this guy, de Klerk, he ends up allowing Nelson Mandela free. So lets him go free. Eventually, Nelson Mandela and de Klerk win a Nobel Prize for peace efforts that they were both making in South Africa. And in 1994, when anybody is allowed to run for president, Nelson Mandela is elected the first Black South African president in South Africa. Go ahead and make a two. We're going to write down April 27th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president. So in 1994, when I said anybody can run for president, Nelson Mandela runs for president, and then he becomes president of South Africa. All right. So that's it with today's notes.